Imagine a winter evening in Scandinavia 100 years ago. The year is 1925, perhaps, or 1920. The place is a farm somewhere in rural Sweden, Norway, Denmark, or Finland. The details vary, but the essence is the same. The sun, which barely rose above the horizon at midday, has already set. It is 3:30 in the afternoon, and the sky beyond the small windows is black. Outside, the temperature has dropped well below freezing, snow lies thick on the ground, and the wind moves through the forest like a living thing, shaking branches and piling drifts against the walls of the farmhouse. Inside, the transition from day to night has already happened. Tools have been put away, animals tended, water carried in from the well. The outdoor world has been closed off and will remain so until morning. The family, parents, children, perhaps a grandparent, and often one or two hired hands or servants, gathers in the main room. This is not a large house by modern standards. It may be partially dug into the earth for insulation, with thick logs of logs chinked with moss and peat. The floor might be simple wood or even packed earth. There is one room that can be reliably heated, and this is where everyone will spend the next several hours until it is time to retreat to the cold sleeping quarters under piles of wool and sheepskin. A stove or fireplace burns in the center or along one wall, fed carefully with wood that was cut and stacked months ago. The warmth does not reach the corners of the room, where frost sometimes forms on the inside of the walls. But near the fire, there is heat enough to work by and to keep the worst of the cold at bay. One or two oil lamps have been lit, carefully because oil is not unlimited and must last through the long winter. The light they cast is weak and golden, enough to see faces and hands, but leaving much of the room in shadow. The windows, small and thick, show nothing but blackness outside. The house feels like an island in an ocean of dark. What happens next, how these people spend the next 5, 6, or even 7 hours before sleep, is a story of resourcefulness, endurance, and a particular kind of social life that has almost entirely disappeared. This is not a romantic tale of cozy huge, though there are moments of warmth and comfort. It is the reality of winter evenings before electricity, before radio, before the infrastructure of modernity softened the edges of the northern winter. It is a story of work, of stories, of long silences, of cold that pressed constantly at the boundaries of warmth, and of communities that survived the dark months by drawing close and making do with what they had. A century ago, the structure of a winter day in Scandinavia was dictated entirely by the sun, or rather by its absence. In the far north, the polar night meant the sun did not rise at all for weeks or months. Even in the southern parts of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, winter daylight was brief and weak. The sun might rise around 9 in the morning and set by 3 or 4 in the afternoon, leaving the vast majority of each 24-hour cycle in darkness. This meant that evening, as we understand it, the hours after work, before sleep, occupied a much larger portion of the day. By mid-afternoon, outdoor work had to cease. There was simply not enough light to continue safely. Farmers and their families completed the last essential tasks. Animals were fed and secured in their barns or brought into the house itself in extreme cold. Water was fetched from the well, often through ice. Firewood was brought inside for the night. Paths were cleared of new snow. These final tasks were performed in twilight or full darkness, guided by memory and feel as much as by sight. Once inside, the heavy door was closed and barred against the wind. The transition was absolute. The outer world ceased to exist in any practical sense. For the next 16 or 17 hours, the household would be sealed inside its wooden shell, dependent entirely on what had been stored, prepared, and brought in before the door closed. This enforced confinement shaped everything that followed.
Unlike a modern evening where one might go out again to a store, a restaurant, a friend's house, the winter evening of 1925 offered no such possibility. You were where you were with the people you were with until morning. If something was forgotten outside, it stayed there. If someone became ill, help was not a phone call away. The household was on its own. Children understood this from a young age. They learned not to wander off after dark, not to open the door unnecessarily, letting precious heat escape, and to settle into the rhythm of the indoor hours. Adults, too, adjusted their expectations. The day's labor was done. What came now was a different kind of time, not leisure in the modern sense, but a slower indoor existence that combined rest, maintenance work, and the social and psychological task of enduring the long dark together.
The single most defining feature of a winter evening a century ago was the scarcity of light and heat. These were not givens to be summoned with the flip of a switch or the turn of a dial. They were resources, carefully managed, limited by what had been harvested, stored, and could be afforded. Light came primarily from oil lamps or candles. In wealthier households, kerosene lamps provided a steady, relatively bright flame. In poorer ones, tallow candles or simple wick in oil dishes were used. Either way, light was expensive and finite. Families rationed it carefully, lighting only one or two sources at a time, and often only in the part of the room where work was being done. The result was a room divided by light and shadow. The area immediately around the lamp or candle was the center of activity. This is where people sat to sew, to read, to do handwork that required visibility. Beyond this circle, the room faded into dimness. Faces in the shadows were barely visible. The corners of the room were pools of complete darkness, sometimes inhabited by stored goods, tools, or simply cold air. Heat was similarly concentrated. The stove or fireplace was the heart of the house, and people arranged themselves around it in a rough hierarchy of need and status. The elderly and the very young might sit closest. Adults engaged in work that required warmth, such as spinning or knitting, took the next ring. Those doing tasks that generated their own heat, or who were simply hardier, sat farther away. The far ends of the room could be cold enough that breath misted in the air. This geography shaped social interaction. Conversation happened mostly among those sitting near each other in the warmth and light. Those in the dimmer, colder edges of the room might listen, might contribute occasionally, but were somewhat removed. The room, though shared, was not uniform. It had zones, and your place in those zones could shift depending on age, task, or health. Fuel for heat, wood, peat, dried dung in some areas, had to last the entire winter. Running out was a genuine crisis. Families calculated carefully, burning enough to stay warm, but not so much that supplies would be exhausted before spring. On the coldest nights, everyone simply wore more layers indoors. It was common to sleep in wool clothing, under heavy blankets, sometimes with heated stones wrapped in cloth placed in the bed before sleep. Evening was not purely rest. Much of the household's winter survival depended on work that could be done indoors, and the long hours after dark were valuable time. Women spun wool and flax, wove cloth, sewed and mended clothing, knitted socks and mittens, and prepared materials for the coming seasons. Men repaired tools, carved wooden implements, mended fishing nets, worked leather, and engaged in the making of essential objects: handles, spoons, buckets, rope. In Finland, winter was the season for tar production, a major industry. Tar making required careful preparation of wood and equipment, much of which could be done indoors during evening hours. In coastal areas, fishermen repaired nets and lines, work that was painstaking and endless, but could be done by lamplight while sitting near the fire. These tasks were repetitive, rhythmic, and often allowed for conversation or listening. Hands moved in patterns learned over years, freeing the mind to wander or to engage with others.
This was work, but it was not the hard, cold, urgent labor of daylight. It was slower, quieter, sustainable for hours at a time. Children helped with simpler tasks, carding wool, winding yarn, holding materials, fetching tools. This was how they learned the skills they would need as adults. The winter evenings were, in effect, a multi-generational workshop and classroom where knowledge passed from old to young through demonstration and repetition with few words needed. There was a moral dimension to this evening work. Idleness was frowned upon, especially in the Lutheran cultures of Scandinavia, where the Protestant work ethic ran deep. To sit with empty hands was to waste time, to fail in one's duty to the household. Even the elderly, if able, would engage in some small task, sorting seeds, winding thread, telling stories while their hands moved. Yet the work was also companionable. People sat together, shared the warmth and light, and moved through the hours in a kind of collective rhythm. The sound of the household at work, the whir of the spinning wheel, the scrape of a knife on wood, the soft click of knitting needles became the soundtrack of winter evenings, as familiar and comforting as the crackle of the fire.
In the absence of radio, television, or recorded music, entertainment and information came from human voices. Winter evenings were the time for storytelling, and in some parts of Scandinavia, this was formalized into a tradition called kvöldvaka, evening wake in Icelandic. During kvöldvaka, the household would gather in the main heated room, called a badstofa in Iceland, and tell stories, recite poetry, sing songs, and share news and gossip. This was not occasional, it was the structure of nearly every winter evening. The stories ranged from folk tales and sagas passed down through generations to recent events in the community, to personal memories and family histories. Some individuals were known as particularly skilled storytellers. In Iceland, there were even itinerant storytellers who traveled from farm to farm in winter, offering their repertoire in exchange for food and shelter. Their arrival was an event, breaking the monotony and bringing new tales into the household's collection. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, certainly, helping the hours pass, but they also educated, transmitting cultural values, historical knowledge, and practical wisdom. They reinforced social bonds, as shared stories created shared identity, and they provided a way to process fear, uncertainty, and the strangeness of life by shaping it into narrative, giving it structure and meaning. Children listened, absorbing not only the content, but the rhythms of language, the art of storytelling itself. They learned how to hold an audience, how to build tension, how to deliver a punchline or a moral. By the time they were adults, they would have heard thousands of stories, and many would be able to recite them from memory, passing them on to the next generation. Songs were also central. Work songs, ballads, hymns, and folk tunes filled the room. Singing together created a sense of unity and warmth that went beyond the physical. It lifted spirits, marked the passage of time, and gave voice to emotions that might otherwise have remained unexpressed. Some songs were regional or family-specific, carrying meanings and memories unique to that household. Literacy varied by region and class. In some areas, particularly in Sweden after the Church Law of 1686 required basic literacy for confirmation, many rural people could read. Books, though few, were treasured. A household might own a Bible, a hymnal, perhaps a book of folk tales or an almanac. These were read aloud in the evenings, often multiple times, until everyone knew the contents by heart. Letters from distant relatives or friends were read and reread, analyzed and discussed, a connection to the world beyond the snow-locked farm.
Food in winter was a careful balance between sustaining the household and stretching limited stores until spring. The evening meal, eaten by lamplight, was usually simple: porridge made from barley or oats, bread, perhaps salted or dried fish, occasionally preserved meat. In farming communities, dairy products were important if the family kept cows through the winter. Milk, cheese, and butter provided crucial calories and nutrients. But feeding livestock through the winter was itself a challenge, and not all animals survived. In some years, households faced the choice of slaughtering animals early or watching them starve. In hunting and ice fishing supplemented stores. Moose, deer, and smaller game could be taken in winter, and fish could be caught through holes in the ice, providing fresh protein that broke the monotony of preserved food. These were not leisure activities, but necessary labor, often dangerous in the cold and dark. Coffee, where it could be afforded, was a treasured luxury, often reserved for special occasions or Sunday evenings. In poorer households, substitutes made from roasted grains or roots were used. Tea, likewise, was precious. The hot drink, whatever it was, served a psychological as much as a physical function. It was warmth, comfort, a small ritual that marked the evening and gave structure to time. Alcohol, beer, aquavit, homemade spirits, played a role, particularly during festivals and gatherings. Christmas, which stretched over several weeks in Scandinavian tradition, was a time of relative plenty, when stored food was brought out and shared, when neighbors visited despite the cold, and when the long darkness was pushed back, at least temporarily, by feasting and celebration. But on ordinary evenings, the meal was modest, eaten around the table or near the fire, often in relative silence as tired bodies refueled. Grace was said, habits of cleanliness and order maintained, and then the dishes were cleared and the evening's work resumed. Not every evening was spent entirely within the single household. Even in winter, there were communal structures that brought people together, breaking the isolation and providing social, spiritual, and practical support. In Finland, the sauna was central to winter life. It was not merely a place to bathe, but a multi-purpose building used for slaughtering animals, curing meat, giving birth, and sometimes as living quarters when the main house became too cold. Heating the sauna was a production, but once warm, it served the whole family. Saturday evening sauna was a ritual. The household would bathe, emerging clean and warm, then move into the week with bodies and spirits renewed. In some cases, families would heat the sauna, bathe, and then sleep there, bringing livestock in as well for the shared warmth. This was not romantic. It was survival, a pragmatic use of heat and space when temperatures outside dropped to lethal levels. The church was another gathering point. Sunday services meant travel, often by horse-drawn sledge over snow-packed roads, but they provided contact with the wider community. News was exchanged, disputes resolved, marriages arranged, and social bonds maintained. The journey itself could be dangerous in blizzards or extreme cold, but for many, the isolation of staying home every week was worse than the risk. In some regions, winter markets or tings, assemblies, were held, times when trade happened, justice was administered, and people from scattered farms came together. These events broke the monotony of winter evenings and provided stories and news that would be repeated and discussed for weeks afterward. For children, winter evenings were a mix of boredom, learning, cold, and the comfort of routine. They went to bed early, often by 6 or 7, partly because they were tired from the day's chores, partly because there was little else to do once darkness fell, and partly to conserve heat and light. Bedrooms, if separate from the main room, were unheated. Children slept together for warmth, sometimes several to a bed, under piles of wool blankets and sheepskins. Chamber pots were used to avoid the necessity of going outside in the night. Frost formed on the inside of windows and walls. Getting up in the morning required courage, a quick dash to the warmth of the main room, where the fire had, with luck, been kept alive through the night. Before sleep, there might be prayers, stories, or songs. These bedtime rituals provided comfort and structure, helping children manage the darkness and cold that pressed around the house. The knowledge that parents and other adults were still awake, keeping watch, tending the fire, made the cold bedroom bearable. For adults, evening could stretch until 9, 10, or even later. The work would continue as long as there was light and wakefulness to sustain it. Eventually, the lamp would be extinguished, the fire banked to last until morning, and the household would retreat to the cold beds, ending another day of endurance. The long wait for spring was felt most acutely in these evening hours. Each day was nearly identical to the last, the same cold, the same darkness, the same tasks, the same faces. Time moved slowly. The solstice, when the days began to lengthen, was celebrated not with loud festivity, but with quiet relief. The knowledge that the sun was returning, even incrementally, gave psychological strength to face the weeks that remained.
Winter evenings in Scandinavia 100 years ago were shaped by scarcity, cold, darkness, and the limits of technology. They were not evenings as we understand them today, a few pleasant hours of leisure and entertainment before bed. They were the dominant reality of winter life, stretching from mid-afternoon to the following morning, occupying the vast majority of the day for months on end. These evenings required resourcefulness. Light and heat were managed like precious currencies. Work continued indoors by lamplight. Stories, songs, and conversation filled the hours and knit the household together. Food was simple but sustaining. The sauna, the church, and occasional communal gatherings provided relief from isolation, and children learned through lived experience the patience and endurance required to survive the northern winter. This was not a romantic time. It was hard, cold, and monotonous. Yet within that hardship, people created moments of warmth, connection, and meaning. The evening hours, though long and dark, were also the time when families sat together, when stories were passed down, when skills were taught, and when the community, however small, was maintained against the indifferent cold outside. When we look back at those winter evenings, we see not only hardship, but also a kind of human achievement, the ability to survive and even find meaning in conditions that would defeat us today. The people of 1925 Scandinavia did not conquer the winter. They learned to live with it, to move through it, to endure it together until the light returned. And in remembering how they spent those long, dark hours, by lamplight, by firelight, in work and story and the quiet company of those they loved and depended on, we might ask ourselves what we have gained and what we have lost in the century since, and whether there are lessons in those old evenings that still have something to teach us about endurance, community, and the art of being present in the dark.